Go ahead.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marie Kenyon, and I'm the director of the Peace and Justice Commission for the Archdiocese of St. Louis. On behalf of our co-sponsors, which include the Jewish Community Relations Council, the Interfaith Partnership, YWCA, the Merowitz Center on Covenant Place, the National Council of Jewish Women, and the nonprofit organization Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. This is the last of a four-part series that has examined systemic racism in four areas: economics, access to healthcare, the environment, and today we're talking about the court system. Racism in the court system is an issue that's very important to me personally. I'm a lawyer and I went to law school at St. Louis U. When I was in law school, I interned at the public defender's office. At that time, Judge Ronnie White, who now is on the federal bench and previously had been appointed the first African-American to serve on the Supreme Court, which sadly did not happen until 1995. But anyway, at that time, this was in the 80s, Judge White was a trial lawyer in the city public defender's office, and I was one of his interns. I will never forget being in the courtroom with him one day during a criminal trial, and the witness was asked to point out the defendant, and she pointed to Judge White, even though he was sitting at the defense table in a suit and had his files in front of him. Sadly, this was not the only time that occurred. Before I was appointed to be the director of the Peace and Justice Commission, I was the founder and managing attorney for Catholic Legal Assistance Ministry, which is a free law office that represents poor people, mainly civil matters, victims of domestic violence and clients like that. And I regularly had law school interns work with me. I can't tell you the number of times in my almost 30 years of practicing when, if I had a student of color standing next to me, the judge would mistake my student for my client. I promise you that did not happen when I had a white student with me. Our format today, as it has been for all of our forums, includes a perspective from a clergy member, remarks from a keynote speaker that will dive deeply into the issue, and then an opportunity to hear from a St. Louis citizen who is generous enough to share their real life challenge of dealing with systemic racism. We will also include resources to deepen your learning and take action to improve racial equity in our region. And finally, we're going to leave some time to move into breakout groups to spend time discussing and reflecting on what we've heard today. To begin, I'd like to introduce Alyssa Banford. Alyssa is the Director of Engagement for the Jewish Community Relations Council, and along with Cheryl Edelstein, one of the two people who has made this series happen. I promise you, this series would not have happened without these two remarkable women. Alyssa is going to provide an overview on systemic racism and review community standards for today's meeting. Alyssa?
She's muted.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the heads up that I was muted. So before we dive into the program, you all know what time it is if you've joined us before, and if you haven't, it's time to define some vocabulary words. We all want to make sure that we're on the same page heading into this discussion, because there can be lots of varieties of definitions, and so we all want to make sure that we're speaking the same language. Okay, so to begin, we're going to name three types of racism: individual, cultural, and systemic. None of these are completely separate, and they all work together to keep the status quo. But let's break them down. Individual racism refers to an individual's beliefs, attitudes, and actions that perpetuate racism. Examples include telling racist jokes. It also encompasses collusion, which is the act of going along with or accepting things the way they are. Another form, a subcategory of individual racism, is implicit bias. Now, this is a new one for this week. It's very important for our topic today. So every single one of us has implicit bias. It's implicit. This means that our culture and our circle of influence over the years has molded our way of thinking to create schemas. that is basically a pattern of thought that categorizes information in our minds. So these schemas leak into our everyday life. This is an important term to remember as we continue today's conversation. All right, so let's talk about one way that our bias can be formed. This would be through cultural racism. This refers to representations, messages, and stories conveying the idea that white behavior or values are better than others. And you'll see cultural racism promoted in advertisements, TV, movies, etc. What does the bad guy wear? Black. What does the good guy usually wear? White. Angel food cake is white. Devil's food cake is black. There are a tremendous number of those types of examples found throughout our society. And those are some of the subtle or more subtle patterns that are found as one example of like how our implicit bias is formed. So not only does cultural racism perpetuate ideas of superiority, it also enforces internalized racism. So then lastly, there's systemic racism, which has the subcategories of structural and institutional. These terms are often used interchangeably. An example of institutional racism can be found within government policies, such as the redlining policy, which explicitly restricted the ability of African Americans to get loans or to improve their homes. Structural racism is the normalization and legitimization of dynamics. So an example of that is the huge difference in life expectancy between the Black population and the white population. So then take all that together. Systemic racism as a whole is the distribution of resources, power, and opportunity which disadvantage Black people and people of color. And we find systematic racism in banks, schools, companies, government agencies, law enforcement, military, etc. Now, what is the result of systemic racism? So many things. That includes disparities of wealth and income, employment, criminal justice charges, home ownership, level of education, representation in politics, health, mortality rates, and so many more areas. Systemic racism also shows up in other ways too, such as in schools and businesses when they prohibit dreadlocks, cornrows, or braids in the dress code. Okay, now today's topic, which is the court system, it's so large and so complicated, it touches on each form of racism. All right, so for example, you find individual racism and implicit bias in police officers, judges, and juries. You find institutional racism in laws such as the three strikes law. Structural racism is the normalization of longer sentences that are given to Black people and people of color. And systemic racism is the entire mess jumbled up into one awful giant problem. Okay, so we've only mentioned a few things that go into inequality in the court and justice system. I know we'll be hearing more about it later on today. So what are we striving for? We are striving for equity. What is equity? Why aren't we using the term equality? Equality is giving everyone the exact same resources. Equity is the distribution of resources based on an individual's needs. It takes into account differing circumstances in order to reach an equal outcome. So Race Forward defines racial equity as both an outcome and a process. So I'd like us to keep that in mind as we go forward through today's program. I know that's a lot of information, but when you're committed to being an anti-racist, it means actively taking the time to learn the various forms of racism and to commit to learning the new terms that come out all the time. This is an ever-changing, like, giant piece of information that's constantly growing. We're learning more every day. So thank you for hanging on with us. We really appreciate you joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to you, Marie.
All right, thanks so much, Alyssa. It's now my honor to introduce Dr. Shima Rostami. She is a representative of the Shia Islamic community in St. Louis. She serves as a member of the Interfaith Partnership Cabinet representing Dr. Bahar Bastani. Shima is the executive director of Gateway Human Trafficking. She's a human rights activist who's involved in the prevention of human trafficking in the greater St. Louis area, the United States, as well as international communities. She is an advocate for the human rights of children, paying special attention to the issue of child soldiers in armed conflicts, a form of child trafficking. She's an adjunct faculty member at the University of Missouri in St. Louis in the Department of Sociology. She has a doctorate in educational leadership, and her doctoral study focused on developing moral education to combat human trafficking. Shima?
Thank you so much, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you for participating in this wonderful program. On behalf of Interfaith Partnership, all the partners in the program, and Dr. Bastani and Muslim community, I want to thank you. So I have a huge mission to explain a little bit about the position of Islam concerning race and also racism and correction systems for you in 5 minutes. So I'm going to do my very best to provide you as I can. So let's begin. So when Islam came to the world hundreds years ago, it has a special mission. And the mission was to fight against so many wrong issues, including racism. So in the Islamic world, we have two main resources as Muslims of the contemporary time to get the definitions, the policies, the procedures of Islam about various issues. Those two resources are Quran, which is the book of the Muslims, and also the history and navigations of the Prophet Muhammad's, peace be upon him, reactions and actions and talks on various issues and his close followers. So let's begin and talk about the issue of racism and the resources and references we have in both two Islamic main resources. One is Quran. So beginning of the Islam, Quran mentions various verses in the Holy Book about racism. It's very interesting and fascinating. When you review the book, you recognize that racism has roots in hundreds years ago. Various verses in Quran mentions that you are, meaning human, is created based on differences in race and tribes. However, the betterness is about the righteousness, not about the race. And keep repeating that in many, many verses of the Quran, that good people, better people are those people who are righteous people. It doesn't matter what is your race, which tribe you are from, if you are poor or you are rich. So this is the theory and what we have in the written statements of the Quran. Let's just move on to see about some actions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when he came, how he needed to fight with those unjust policies, laws, and regulation in the contemporary time that Islam came in, which was right now is considered as a country, Saudi Arabia, all around the Mecca, those areas. So I want to provide you a case study, and that is the story of Bilal Habashi. So Bilal is a very important character in the Islam and the history of Islam. So Bilal was an African American slave for one of the very well-known families of the time. So he actually got to be one of the first people converted to Islam. When his master figured it out, they started keeping him in the correction system of the time, prosecuting him and persecuting him because he converted to a God and to a new faith without his master's permission. And they started torturing him in the name of laws and policies of the time, that a slave was not allowed to have their own opinion without their masters. So I just want to quickly short 2-minute video about that important issues and scene of a very famous historic movie we have about the life of Prophet Muhammad. So I'm gonna warn those community members that they may be emotional. Don't watch these 2 minutes, but I think it's very important for everyone else to just see these 2 minutes.
Remember, they are the gods of your owner. I bought your humanity, Bilal, when I bought you. You will be corrected. One God. There's only one God. Who's stronger now? Your master, or this one God of yours? One God. There's only one God. Bring the stones. One God. One God. Crush him. Break him.
Have you finished with him?
There's only one God.
I could swear the slave was preaching.
What?
Lord Umayyah! Abu Bakr will pay 100 dinar for this slave.
Wait now. It's against our social order to sell a slave during his correction.
The offer is to Lord Umayyah. 200.
If the price of slaves is raised, we shall have to bathe ourselves next year.
Take him. He's no use to me anymore. Kill him or take him. I'm finished with him.
So Abu Bakr is the first, after the Prophet Muhammad, is the first person gets the Muslim community's leadership. But in that scene, as you see, Prophet Muhammad told Abu Bakr, go and buy that, free that slave in the name of Islam so that we can save him. But the important point is that Prophet Muhammad doesn't stop there. After releasing Bilal, he empowers him, gives Bilal one of the most important positions in the Islam world of the time. History says Bilal had a very strong, beautiful voice. So Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, nominated Bilal as the first muazzin for the Islamic world. Muazzin is the person who announced the praying time at least 5 times for Muslims. So Prophet Muhammad gives Bilal that strong, special social positions in the world of Islam to just make everyone be familiar, to fight against racism. These people, because they don't belong to these social positions, they are slaves in that social positions, they can't be in leadership positions. So Prophet Muhammad gives him that leadership positions, and those empowerments keep going. And finally, I'm going to close with the last speech of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So 2 months before he passed away, Prophet Muhammad had his final last public speech in front of Muslims after coming back from Hajj or Mecca ceremony. In that last speech, he announced so many important things for the future of the Islamic world. He mentions so many rights of vulnerable people, including poor, including women, and lastly, he mentions to the race issues. And he says, for the last time, I am going to leave this world soon. But I want you as the humanity and human being knows that the better people for God, in front of God, are not Arabs, are not white people, are not black. It doesn't actually matter what is your race or ethnicity. It's about righteousness. Righteousness is what you are going to judge for in the day of judgment and in front of God and his judgment and judicial system. Again, thank you so much for
Great. Thank you,
doing
Shima.
this
We
for us.
really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Okay. I'd like to now introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Kim Norwood of Washington University School of Law. Professor Norwood's research focuses on Black think, colorism, implicit bias, and the intersection of race, class, and public education in America. She lectures around the world on colorism, various social justice and civil rights issues, implicit and explicit bias issues, and was part of the national team of experts consulted to advise Starbucks on its national implicit bias training agenda. Professor Norwood serves on a ton of different committees and commissions, but for our purposes today, the most important ones are, she is a member of the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Fairness created by the Missouri Supreme Court and tasked with identifying challenges, research solutions, and making recommendations for improvement in the state's justice system. She served on the Municipal Division Work Group assigned to take a hard look at the municipal courts in Missouri and recommend ways to overhaul them. Professor Norwood is a native of New York City. She received her BA from Fordham and her JD from the University of Missouri at Columbia. Before joining the faculty of WashU's Law School in 1990, Kim worked at the law firm of Brian Cave. I have known Kim a long time. Kim is a prophetic voice and has been thinking and writing and teaching about issues of race and racial justice in our courts long before the Ferguson uprising. It is such an honor for me today to present Professor Kim Norwood.
Thank you, Marie. That was wonderful. Thank you. That was over generous. I'm really honored to be here today. When Marie called me, it was just an immediate no-brainer. I have been given 20 minutes to explain race in the court system, and I'm not sure I'll be able to do it in 20 minutes, but we're sure going to try. Because this is a huge, huge topic, as you can imagine. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoints. What I've done is, particularly given the short period of time we have, I'm a visual person, and so I think I can sort of get to you a lot deeper if I can show you images. And so I'm going to sort of share a bunch of slides with you, and hopefully they will remain with you after this talk. So we've heard already some examples of how people have been treated differently. And so I want to start there, because one of the things that we know to be true is that whatever we're experiencing, whatever we're breathing, whatever we're living in society, those things are in us. And not only are they in us, but they are wherever we are. So they follow us. And so we will see how these things follow you, right? And so whether you're out in a park or whether you're in a courtroom, right, you still have these biases, right? So this is what would you do episode that I like to share with audiences. Sometimes if I have time, it involves a young man who there's a bike that's locked. And so you have this image here, this young Black man who's using a saw to try to unchain the bike. This also happens with a white male a few minutes later. And so the producers of the show are sort of videoing this to see how people will react. And the way people react when it's a white male who's trying to free the bike is completely different from the way they react when it's a Black male. And so white male, people will keep walking by, they don't confront him at all. Some people ask him what he's doing, he tells them, and then they walk away. Not so much when he's Black, right? When he's Black, they absolutely are very confrontational with him. And in fact, several call the police. Identical conduct treated differently based on skin color. Same thing here with this hoodie policy, no hoodie policy that was created a few years ago at a mall in Memphis. And so Black teenagers were arrested for coming into the mall with hoodies on in violation of the hoodie policy. When this was aired on some news station in Memphis, a group of 4 female white friends decided to test the policy. And so the 4 of them, also wearing hoodies, went into the mall in violation of the policy, and they were not confronted. Again, identical treatment, identical policy, but the treatment is completely different based on race, right? So these kinds of things can manifest in lots of ways, right? And so we absolutely see a lot of explicit bias, conscious bias, right? And so these are just a few examples of unfortunately, these things are getting worse and worse, but you get a sense here of what we mean by explicit. Implicit is a little different, right? Sometimes people do things and they're not really thinking about it. It's unconscious. And so I have 2 examples to share here. One is the very common phenomenon that magazines have of lightening the skin color of the people who appear on the cover. And when these people have been interviewed, they say, oh, yeah, I didn't realize we were doing that to, I certainly didn't do it because I think lighter is better, right? Like so why are you doing it, right? We have this other image down here, very famous image from the Katrina floods back in Louisiana. In both cases, these people were observed taking food from a grocery store, putting them in their packages and bags, and then walking away. As you can see, the water is waist high. I don't know if you could read this, but the first image here is of a young Black male, and he is identified as having looted food. There's a image here below of a white male who did the exact same thing, but he is described as having found bread and water, right? So who's the looter? Where does that go for you, right? And so this, again, is identical conduct, right? But the way in which we treat it is very differently. We also get these sort of seemingly race-neutral policies, right? Non-race-based policies. I have a few examples here, but again, they have racialized outcomes, and we see this everywhere. And so this first image up here, Ohio some years ago had banned Afro puffs. These images over here on your left of 3 young Black girls are wearing Afro puffs. Those hairstyles, despite the fact that they were neat and clean and beautiful, were banned in the school, not so much for the hairstyles on the right, which are similar, right? The only difference I would advance to you is the fact that for African descendant people, the hair typically grows out of the scalp very tightly curled. These are the exact same hairstyles, but one is based on tightly curled hair and one is based on straight hair. Neutral policy Some get suspended, some don't, right? Down below, we have a mom who enrolled her daughter in a school using a friend's address, which is considered theft of education. She was fined, she was jailed, I think it was a 3-year jail sentence, and she was ordered to pay back $30,000. That contrasts with some of the stuff that we've seen with the college scandals, and this is a particular incident here where this actress paid $500,000 for her kids to get into a college, and she, I think it was, what does it say, 2 months was her sentence, right? These are really identical, very similar types of actions, completely different results. The big one we see all the time comes up in the drug area, for example. This is the 2018 data. The data has been consistent over the years. Marijuana use between Blacks and whites are virtually identical. You can see that over here in these columns. But then when you look at who's arrested, it is very different. So we have this law says you're not supposed to do this, but how are people enforcing that law? One group is targeted, the other is not, right? Okay, so let's look at the court system. First of all, let's just sort of touch base with the US population. This is about where we are now. White men make up 31% of the US population, white women 32%. So there's a majority, right, of about 62% now, 63%. I've decided to just sort of look a little bit at state courts. You know, we have a federal court system and we have a state court system. Most people interact with and use the state court system at a much, much higher level. And so that's what I thought it would make sense to look at. If you look at this chart from the Gavel Gap, again, you'll see the representation in society, but look at what we see in the court system. Who's running the courts? Who are our judges? Overwhelming majority of judges, almost 60%, 57% in the trial court are white men. White women make up 26%. Together, this is about 80%, right? 80% of our state court judges are white. In both cases, there's a higher representation, right? Well, certainly for the men, for the men here, there's a higher representation than in their place in society, right? They're 30% of society, 57% of trial judges, 58% of state judges. For white women here, 31% in society, and they're slightly under, right, their representation as judges, right? So, and of course, for sure, when you're looking at women of color and men of color, right, like they're much lower, okay? But look at who appears before these judges, right? So with 80% of the judges being white, there's a much larger percentage, right, of the African-American community vis-a-vis white members, right, who are in the court system, right? And so Blacks are about 15% of the US population, or maybe 13% now, but they're 44% of the defendants who appear in court, state court, I should say. Okay, so that's just sort of the picture of who's making decisions. There's been a lot done over the last few years, I would say, particularly in the ABA, sort of looking at bias among judges. There's some great videos on the American Bar Association website looking at the biases of judges, of prosecutors, of public defenders. So if any of you are interested in that, either let me know, or if you're a lawyer, just go on and go to the site. There's some really nice material there. So now several courts have recently been studying what racial bias looks like in the court system. New York just came out with a phenomenal report. It's about 130 pages or so. It came out in October of 2020, looking at the entire New York court system. And it looks at judges, secretaries, assistants, administrators, clerks, jurors, and it tracks explicit forms of bias, implicit forms. It's looking at policies. And they've come up with maybe, I can't remember the exact number, maybe around 80 recommendations for change. And so that work is beginning. There's some work that's, this just started, right? And so this is a long way before we see results maybe, but they've done the deep work in terms of producing the data and the reports. And so now they're actually trying to put some policies and changes in place that will change outcomes, right? Lots of other courts have done this too. Massachusetts did a similar study not too long ago. This also came out in September of 2020, and it looked at the criminal justice system in Massachusetts. And it was a 4-year study that was done by Harvard as at the request of a judge in Massachusetts. And the one conclusion for the racial disparities in the criminal justice system was systemic racism. New Jersey has looked at this. I think Pennsylvania is looking at this. As Marie Kenyon mentioned, Missouri is now looking at this. I serve on a commission that's sort of beginning this work now of gathering data and looking at how this looks in the Missouri system. So I'll just show you a few quick instances here, recent, right? This is April of 2021 of some judicial biases that can manifest in the courtroom. Now, so the really scary thing about some of this, right, is that what I'm showing you are things that have been expressed, things that have been verbalized. You always sort of wonder, what about the ones who don't verbalize, right? Like, what does that look like? And what does justice look like for the people who are appearing before that judge? So this is one image. This was another one out of Pennsylvania, where a judge called a juror Aunt Jemima. This report that was done out of Florida a few years ago is just a phenomenal report on how judges sentence people differently, although they're in the same boat. And so if you look at this chart, for example, what we see here in all of these different counties, what this report did, and this is just a phenomenal study of the court sentencing practices in Florida. What we see is in this report is that we look at all of these, we look at each county, and they're tracking similar crimes, similar experiences, similar backgrounds. What do the sentences look like? So you say you get a Black male who robbed, a white male who robbed. They have similar backgrounds, similar experiences, similar history, etc. How are they sentenced? Are they sentenced similarly or not? And what you can see from this chart in every county is that overwhelmingly Blacks are receiving much higher, harsher sentences for identical conduct than their white counterparts. Right. And so this is for felony drug possession. But if you actually access this report, you would find this in the burglary, robbery, in other categories as well. It's the same results. We see identical situations, but Black folks are sentenced at much higher rates. Study done on who gets to be on death row. Right. And so there's a real powerful study out of Stanford that stands for the proposition that the darker you are and the blacker you are, meaning if you have thick lips, if you have a broad nose, if you have an afro, right? In addition to dark skin, those people are much more likely to be on death row than others in similar situations who are either lighter, right? Like in this case here, where you have a lighter skinned Black male versus a darker skinned Black male, or if you're talking Black versus white. In either of those cases, the person who is the darker skinned person and the Blacker person ends up more likely to be on death row. Okay, if we go to look at prosecutors, for example, most prosecutors in the United States are white. This report that came out in 2015 has 95% of prosecutors as white. And of that 95% of prosecutors, almost 79% are white males. You may have heard this mentioned before, that prosecutors are like God, right? I mean, they have so much power. And so who the prosecutor is matters, and that person's orientation matters. And so it becomes very important, right, to not only work with the prosecutors who are in office, right, about obtaining justice, right, but also to diversify the prosecutors. What the courts have found, and again, there are all kinds of studies, but even the sort of the studies of court systems, what we found is that I shouldn't say we're studying this in Missouri, but what other courts have found is that at every level, there are racial disparities, and there's no other way to explain it but race, right? When you're constantly looking at an apple and you come up with these different results, you're left at the end of the day sort of scratching your head and saying, well, what is this then? What is going on? And so what these courts have found is that whether to charge a crime, what crime to charge, whether to allow a favorable deal, whether to treat the child as an adult, sentencing recommendation, plea deals offered, all of these things have tremendous racial disparities coming from prosecutors. This is an issue, right? This is a person, he was a prosecutor in Orlando, Florida, after the Pulse Nightmare massacre some years ago. And so I have up here, I'm just going to put up here some samples of the kinds of things that this officer of the court, this person who is supposed to be about justice, was saying, right, on his social media pages and in newspapers, right? The entire city should be leveled. It's void of a single redeeming quality, right? Happy Mother's Day to all you crack holes. It's never too late to turn your life around and tie your tubes. These are people who have physical addictions, right? These are sometimes mental addictions, physical addictions. Maybe we can do treatment as opposed to sterilization, right? Like there are other options, right? But these are the kinds of things that this is the prosecutor saying that and this makes us, we've got to address this, right? They should have shot him in the head, execution on the spot. Really? Right? There's some challenges here. Our time is short, so I'm not going to go into some of the other things, but what to charge? Wildly different. These two teenagers, right, committed the exact same crime. They were charged differently. So one gets a mandatory 15-year sentence, the other gets 6 months in jail. What to charge is important, right? Who to charge, how to charge. In Jersey, a lot of data about how Black and brown children are waived up and treated as adults. Again, comparing apple and apple with white children in their same situation, those white children are not waived up. 90% of Black and brown kids are waived up in this New Jersey study. And you might have seen, we do something similar here in Missouri too, right? You saw this article that came out in October of all of the children, right, in this county who are treated as an adult, right? 95% of them are Black, right? Black and Hispanic. Jurors, we have another problem, right? That just is all kinds of jury studies have been done that show jurors, like everyone else, right, have biases, right? And so they too need education. They need exposure. We need conversation so that they become aware of their biases before they begin their deliberations. Court personnel, right? At every level, whether you're talking about the judge, whether you're talking about prosecutor, whether you're talking about jurors, whether you're talking about court personnel, bias has infected our system, and we have a lot to do to undo it. We're studying this, as I said, in Missouri. You've already seen the one thing I talked about in terms of the Jackson County report, but there are all kinds of, we'll be gathering our data now, but again, early data is showing that that in Missouri, we're constantly seeing Blacks are arrested more, they're convicted more, they're more likely to be convicted on murder charges, they have higher sentences, right? They're stopped more, they're searched more, right? Like all of these ways in which even in our state, we're seeing these racial disparities. So it's a long, long road ahead. I always love to end my comments with this quote by James Baldwin that I really love that says, not everything that we face can be changed, but we can't change anything unless we face it. And so my hope is that this, my words with you today will begin that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Norwood. We are blessed in this region to have Kim doing the work that she's doing, and more importantly, that the future members of the legal profession hear from her and get wisdom from her and her beliefs early in their legal careers. If you have a question for Professor Norwood, please type it into the chat, and hopefully we'll have time for question and answers after our next speakers. So now I'm going to introduce Denise Hollandshead for our local portion of the program. Denise is a reporter for the Before Ferguson, Beyond Ferguson project. The mission of the project is to share the stories of people of color in the St. Louis region as they are challenged by systemic racism. Denise has served as a crime reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for 21 years until she retired in 2019. She specialized in writing stories that went beyond the crime to examine the root causes of the crime, such as poverty and the social determinants of health. So I am honored today to introduce Denise, and Denise will introduce us to Beverly Jones.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Marie. As you mentioned, I am among a group of journalists who have written stories in the hope of advancing the cause of racial equity. These stories, with support from the Pulitzer Center, have appeared in local mainstream media, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, St. Louis American, Riverfront Times, St. Louis Magazine, the Jewish Light, St. Louis Public Radio, and the Catholic Health Association's publication known as Health Progress. In the time of the pandemic, we have set our sights on neighborhoods within the 63106 zip code. Why 63106? Well, a landmark study prepared by researchers at St. Louis University and Washington University Brown School of Social Work revealed that across our entire region, 63106 had the most problematic social determinants of health. One revealing data point, a child born in 63106 in 2010 will have had a life expectancy of 67 years. Contrast that to 63105, Clayton, wealthy and mostly white. There, a child could expect to live to 85. And this was before the pandemic. Our guest today is Beverly Jones. Ms. Jones and I have gotten to know each other very well over the past several months. I first wrote about her last fall for a story that appeared in the Riverfront Times. The Riverfront Times is publishing a follow-up story this week. This forum is focusing on the courts and the justice system. And both Beverly and I have quite a bit of experience with that. Beverly is a community activist and social worker who has long worked in the neighborhoods that make up 63106. She has multiple degrees and certifications in human services and criminal justice. She has worked at Grace Hill Settlement House, a social service and educational agency, and more recently at Marriage Goodwill and with the Job Corps. She had a long track record in helping disadvantaged youth get their lives on track. She also has had some very personal experiences with the justice system, as two of her daughters and a grandson have experienced incarceration in recent years. As mentioned, I have covered public safety for many years, but it is personal to me as well. As you will read in my most recent story, most recently, I lost my brother, Darnell, to COVID. Darnell completed 12 years on a burglary charge nearly 30 years ago at a state facility. After that, he lived an exemplary life until his tragic death just a few months ago. Beverly and I are both here to talk about how the justice system falls heavily and unevenly on people of color, but we are also here to bear witness to the power of family in our lives. We have never stopped loving and praying for our kin, and it makes a difference. So I guess we'll be talking to Beverly now. Ms. Jones?
Hi, everybody.
Beverly, you grew up in North St. Louis County and had quite a journey that took you from drug dealing through addiction to being a resource and guide to help so many others. Tell us a little bit about that and what you learned along the way.
Okay, so yes, I grew up in Normandy, the subdivision of Northwoods, attended Normandy Garfield Junior High and the Normandy Senior High. And so I come from a middle class Black family, and the majority of my neighbors were white. But for me, all I saw were kids. Like, we're kids. We like to play. We like to do the same things that everybody else does. And we ride bikes. You know, we got a mom and a dad. So my upbringing was that of somewhat being kind of sheltered. And I can honestly say that at probably around the age 10 is the first time I was introduced to a substance, that substance being alcohol. Well, I learned really quickly that I could not be an alcoholic because alcohol and I didn't sit well together. So as time went on, I had my first child when I was 15 years old. Now, that was not as a result of anything to do with my mom or my dad. That was about choices that I made, right? And so I did deliver that child. She is 42 years old now. And during that same time period, I started smoking marijuana. And, you know, me being a young parent, not having a job because my mother's main focus for me was to, you know, go to school. So I started selling weed at school to my friends. You know, everybody smoked weed. So it wasn't like we didn't think we were doing anything wrong. Let me say it that way. You know, the journey from then to now, and myself being involved in the criminal justice system, I mean, I want to make sure that the actions that I took as an individual were not a reflection of how I grew up, where I grew up, or anything that my mother and father did. Those were choices that Beverly chose to make. And so then I had to learn to deal with them and to live with them. So.
Okay. You have had a grandson and two of your daughters run into trouble with the law. I know you feel that they need to be held accountable, but do you feel there has been some unfairness in how the justice system has treated them in comparison to others?
I would definitely say yes. One, they're all Black. This is my daughter, Danielle. She's currently at Vandalia. And just a quick thing about her, she went up for the parole board last Wednesday. And so I got up 4:30 in the morning, got dressed, got ready, Vandalia by 8 o'clock. To only get to Vandalia to be told, even after talking to the social worker, making sure my clearance was good, everything was all ironed out, to not be allowed to participate in the hearing. So for me, what that sent a message that she was and is alone, and she is not alone. Regardless of whatever my children do, my grandchildren do, I am their grandmother. I am their mother. I love them. And that's all it is to it. But it just, like, I get there. I mean, the feeling that I had, because I'm standing there looking at them like, you gotta be kidding me. I have just driven over an hour and 45 minutes and I can't go back. Even after the phone calls and all of that. Now, I didn't print out any of the emails because I didn't think that it was necessary, but I was not allowed to participate in her hearing. And like I said, it leaves the impression that she is alone, and that is far from what the reality is. Now, this is my grandson, Michael. I can remember the day that Michael was arrested. Michael,
I'm sorry, Beverly, but can you tell the audience what your Danielle is in jail for and incarcerated for?
Danielle was charged with second degree murder. She was involved in a situation with an abusive individual, and that individual ended up deceased.
Okay. You were talking about Michael?
Yes. So Michael, like I said, I remember the day that Michael was arrested. He had been home with me pretty much all day. He got dressed. And I would say in an hour and a half of him leaving home, I never saw him again. All I got was a phone call that said that he was arrested and what he was arrested for. I was told that I could not, because of my own criminal past, I could not be a witness for him to even say that he had been at home with me all day, because I also have a past of my own. And I just think like that's unfair, in the sense that as much work as I do in the community, when you run my name, yes, there are things that are going to come up. But just because it comes up does not mean that I continue to do now what I did when I was in my teens and my 20s. Like, I'm almost 60 years old. So, you know, I have had it several times. I've, been stopped by the police or been out in Ferguson and detained. And you could tell how a person who has no criminal past is treated versus somebody like me who has a criminal past, but that criminal past does not define me today. How we're treated. We're treated differently through conversation, aggressiveness, all kind of things. They talk to you different. So, I witnessed it firsthand.
Beverly, you have counseled many ex-felons and some who are, and shall we say, at risk of becoming felons. How do you help keep them on the straight and narrow?
Well, I basically just talk to them. I don't judge them about when it comes to their background, where they're from, what they do. I don't come to them with a judging eye. I come to them with empathy, because I know what it's like to be in that situation. And so I listen, and then I talk, and then I get them to think about, if you do this, then the outcomes of that. And then if you do this, then what are the outcomes of that? And to help them to just try to make the best decisions that they can at that time. Do I always succeed? No, I don't. But I do succeed. And, I think that's what actually keeps me going, is knowing that they always have somebody that they can call no matter what time. If I need to show up at a place and be there for support, I do. So if not me, then who? That's the approach that I take.
Great. Beverly, tell the audience a little bit about your degrees. What your degreed in?
Okay, so I went back to school. I was coached by one of the executives that worked at Great Seal to go back to school, and so I did. I remember that first semester I got 2 A's, and you would have thought like I was graduating from high school. I was like, oh my God, I can do this for real. So took me 10 years. I went from having a high school diploma to a master's degree. I have a undergrad in human services, criminal justice, and human resources. And then my master's is in management. And then whenever I can go and take classes or do community things, I always do those as well. And I think when people look at me, a lot of times they don't understand that, like, you don't look. So the thing is I don't look like, and I don't know what am I supposed to look like? Because yes, I try to keep myself together, but that does not mean that I have not had challenges in the last 58 years, right? I've had challenges. And so I have overcome those challenges by giving back to the people in my community, especially young people.
Fantastic. What do people participating in this forum need to know about the justice system in our region? How can they help?
Well, this right here is a start. I would like to thank everybody that had something to say before me. This is a real issue. It's funny to me that even in 2021, some people act as if we make this up. Like those things can't still be happening. Well, they are happening every day. I just was on a live watching a shooting that happened right here off of Grand and almost right below St. Louis Avenue. And it's like, these issues in our community started from a long time ago, but things have not changed. We have moved into this modern era and everybody feels like we should just get over stuff. Well, you can't get over things like this. It's not a magic pill. So we just have to keep working at it and being sincere at what it is that we do. And the understanding of our own personal biases, that's a good way for us to look at how we actually view the rest of the world. So I think that things like this is what needs to happen, and not just on this scale, but on a much larger scale and across the entire United States, because it's not just a St. Louis thing. It's a thing for the entire country.
Okay, great. Okay,
all right, Denise, thank you so much. Beverly, thank you so much for your honesty and willingness to share your story and your family's story with us. Much like Shima and Kim, we are just blessed that these women are doing this amazing work in our region. The question now is, we're a little bit over. We want to end by 1:15, but so what do we do? We can't hear what we've heard today and be like, oh, well, that's interesting. It's important. Well, where do we go from here? What do we do? To that end, I'd like to introduce Amy Hammerman. Amy is part of the leadership of both the National Council of Jewish Women and the Jewish Community Relations Council, and she's going to offer some suggestions. Amy?
Hi, thank you, Marie. As you may know, the General Assembly of the Missouri Legislature is in its last few days of the session. And as often happens, bills move through the House and the Senate, and they end up combining into large omnibus bills, which are often referred to as Christmas tree bills because people like to add all their little stuff onto it. These bills then go to conference committees where legislators from both houses decide what stays in and what gets removed. And then both of the houses have to vote on these bills again. So while we're actually participating in this meeting, two conference committees are meeting, and we're waiting for the outcome to see what the bills look like when they come out. We're in particular watching two bills full of aspects related to the justice system. SB 26 is an anti-protest bill, which increases the penalty for blocking traffic as part of a protest to a felony, among other things. This is an infringement on our First Amendment rights to free speech. While this bill has had some positive amendments added, in general, the National Council of Jewish Women and Jewish Community Relations Council oppose this bill. Please note that I am speaking only for these two organizations and not all of the co-sponsors of this program. We're also following SB 53, which is a police reform bill. Many provisions have been added that are also troubling, as the bill contains many sections that both JCRC and NCJW support. We're advocating in favor of this bill at the moment. Some of the provisions that it addresses are prohibiting use of chokeholds, prohibiting sexual contact with the detainee. It would tighten and better regulate peace officer licensure and commissioning. It would create more police use of force transparency. It would allow parole for certain juvenile offenders, require access to quality feminine hygiene products for jails and prisons statewide, and would also allow for alternative sentencing mechanisms to keep families with children together. In our follow-up email to this session that you'll receive, we will be requesting you to call your state House and Senate members to ask them to oppose SB 26 and to support SB 53. But this, of course, depends on what these bills will actually look like when they come out of committee. My understanding is SB 53 just got voted out of conference committee, but we haven't had a chance to read that bill yet. And as a quick follow-up to our session in March on healthcare access, and systemic racism within that system. At the time, we had spoken with some optimism about Medicaid expansion, because at the time, the governor had included funding for it in the budget in his proposed budget. Unfortunately, since then, the Missouri legislature has passed a budget that does not include funding for the Medicaid expansion that Missouri voters mandated a couple of years ago. So we are encouraging folks who are so inclined to contact Governor Parsons' office and to urge him to veto that budget. Thanks very much. We'll keep you posted.
Great. Thanks so much, Amy. Unfortunately, we have 5 minutes left. We're not going to have time for the breakout groups, but we are going to try to get a couple of questions in. So I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl Adelstein for that section. Cheryl is the Deputy Director of the JCRC. Honestly, she was the catalyst that brought all of us together to do this series. So Cheryl?
Thank you, Marie, and thank you all for being with us today, and thank you for sticking with us. We did ask you to put questions in the chat, and I have not seen any. So if anyone has a question for any of our speakers, if you would go ahead and put it in the chat, that would be great. And I'll kick it off with one for Kim. Professor Norwood, I know you said that you're currently working on this statewide commission through the Missouri Supreme Court. When do you think we can expect to see recommendations from that? And I have a follow-on after that one.
So we are beginning to gather data. This, you know, when you're studying a court system, it takes a long time. So I would not anticipate anything before the end of the year. My hope is that it can be completed by then, but it would first go to the Missouri Supreme Court. I'm not sure how long they would dive into it, right, before they decide next steps. So our current goal is to have something to the Missouri Supreme Court before the end of the year.
Thank you. And as a follow-on, as I was doing a little bit of research before the program, I saw that at one point the commission was going to try to look at municipal courts, and then that was kind of you weren't maybe able to follow through on that because maybe there wasn't jurisdiction. But could you you have any thoughts about the challenges, especially in the St. Louis region, of the municipal court system?
So I really haven't been involved with the municipal courts for several years now. So I really can't speak to where that is now. My understanding was that, so let me back up a little bit. The commission that the Missouri Supreme Court put in place probably has 10 subcommittees. I see Judge Block on this webinar. She deals with Juvenile, the Juvenile Justice Committee. I was originally on a municipal courts committee, and we did a ton of work. And I think we sort of, did everything that we could do and made our recommendations. I know the legislature was doing some stuff as well. But I was then moved over to the law practice group. And so I've really been working more in the last few years looking at racial and ethnic issues within the practice of law. So that's where I've really spent the last couple of years. So I just am not really up to date on what they're doing in the municipal court world. But I do want to say, though, that my understanding is that this other committee, this sub-working group, actually, we're called, on the court system. I mean, we're supposed to be looking at the entire court system. So I don't think that will exclude looking at bias in the municipal courts.
Well, thank you so much for doing that work. And we look forward to seeing the reports and then figuring out how we as citizens can do something actionable, with the results. I think it can feel very overwhelming that we see these huge problems and then nobody really kind of knows what to do to fix them, to address them. Pointing them out is the first step, but then how do we make that change? So we'll keep looking for our ways in. Beverly, let me just ask you a question or two. Did any of the times that you or your family were involved with the justice system, did any of them actually go to trial? And what was that experience like for your family? Or was it more of a plea or other kind of situation? And you're muted, Beverly, so you'll have to unmute yourself. Beverly, can you hear me?
I was muted.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, say that again.
Oh, so my question to you was, with the times that you or your family members have been involved with the justice system, did any of them ever go to trial? Was there ever a trial, or what was that court process like for you? Were pleas involved, or was there jury trials? What did that look like, and how was that process for your family?
So for Linda, there was just a straight sentencing guideline because of probation violation, so no trial there. Danielle did not have, Danielle was sentenced, she chose to be sentenced by the judge. So the judge sentenced her without a trial. And then Michael took a plea. But the bad part about all of that is that, so it's like they're told, if you don't take a plea, then they just gonna give you the whole time. So what happens is then the defendant gets scared, right? Because who wants to do 25 when you offering me 12? And so then you plead guilty, and you plead guilty to all of this stuff, whether it's true or not. And so that, I think that's the bad part about our justice system, is that, you know, all of these plea bargains, you keep saying that I'm guilty. I'm not guilty of everything. I might have done some things, but you know, that fear holds you back from going straight to trial.
Well, Beverly, some would say that the system is doing exactly what it was intended to do. It's the criminal injustice system, and it's set up to harm people, and it's specifically set up to harm people of color. And it's very generous of you to talk about your family and let people who generally don't get to experience this understand what it's like from the perspective of a mother and a grandmother and someone who's watching the system mistreat their family. So thank you for that. For the sake of time, I'm going to return it to Marie to end our program today. And thank you for those who've stayed with us.
And I echo what Cheryl says. We had an amazing group of speakers. I saw a couple of chimes in the chat. Each one of these women should have spoken for an hour, and we couldn't agree with you more. Thanks for being with us today, especially those of you who started with us back in the first session in February. We appreciate you taking the time out to learn and reflect with us. We hope you found it useful. We hope we gave you some food for thought. And like I said, you can't hear what we heard today and be like, oh, well, that was interesting, and live your life. I mean, you have to take what you've heard today and figure out a way to implement change. So thank you all. God bless you. And look for something from us as a group in the future. Thanks so much for joining in. Bye-bye.